It was a cold evening in January 1998 as Trudy went to do her laundry. She got out of the car and even left the door open, but then she vanished. 18 years later, police found out that she'd never left that building. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. It was just after sunrise on a bitter January morning in 1998. East Hampton, Connecticut was still waking up. The town, nestled in the quiet hills of Middlesex County, had always felt safe. It was the kind of place where doors weren't always locked and neighbours still waved to each other from across the street. Main Street was pretty quiet on that early morning as Jeanette Adams pulled into the empty car park. Jeanette worked the morning shift at the local coin-operated laundromat. The place ran 24 hours, open door policy, pay as you go, so it wasn't unusual to see a car or two out front. But this morning, one vehicle caught her eye immediately. A faded Toyota sedan sat idling near the front entrance. No movement inside, just sitting there, engine running. That in itself was odd. Jeanette assumed maybe someone had popped in for a quick early load of laundry and was keeping the car warm. She got out, arms crossed against the chill, and peered around. But there was no sign of anyone. Not in the laundromat, not anywhere nearby. And that's when she noticed something else, a movement in the car. It was a small dog, sitting alone in the front seat, staring at her. Jeanette hesitated. It was freezing outside, easily below zero. The windows of the Toyota were fogged up from the inside. She waited a few moments, figuring the owner would surely reappear any second. But no one came. She knew straight away that something wasn't right. She pushed open the laundromat door and called out. Inside, there was someone, but it was just the handyman who worked odd jobs around town, sometimes helped out with maintenance at the laundromat, Gerald Brian Tuttle. He was wiping down one of the washing machines. Jeanette mentioned the running car with the dog inside, and Gerald said he'd noticed it too. No one had been by in the time he'd been there, and he'd become concerned, so he'd actually called the police to report it in. Even so, Jeanette picked up the phone and called the police too. When officers arrived, the car was still running. Keys were in the ignition and the dog was still inside. The car had been there for hours for sure, but nobody really seemed to know how long. Multiple witnesses would later confirm they'd seen it running as early as 9:30 p.m. the night before, January 11th. Some said they'd walked past it a few times during the night. They assumed the owner was inside grabbing a wash or taking a nap, but now, with daylight creeping in and no one in sight, it was officially suspicious. The police popped the door and carefully coaxed the dog out. Then, someone thought to check the laundromat itself for any evidence that anyone had been there and kind of not returned. They looked inside the machines, in the bins, behind the counter. Then, they found a neatly folded pile of clothing still sitting on top of the dryers. Women's clothes, freshly washed but not collected. And that was their first real clue. Back at the car, a registration check finally turned something up. The vehicle was registered to a 60-year-old local woman named Gertrude Ochankowski. Friends and family knew her better as Trudy. She was a mother of 2 grown daughters and lived just a few miles from the laundromat. And the dog, Muffin, was Trudy's pride and joy. She took Muffin everywhere. Within hours, police were knocking on doors near her home, but no one had seen Trudy. Not that morning or the night before. She had disappeared. East Hampton had its first missing persons case in years. Before her name was in local newspapers and on the TV, before investigators were piecing together the final hours of her life, Gertrude was simply Trudy. She lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment not far from the heart of East Hampton, Connecticut. Just her and Muffin, her little dog, her shadow. Her daughters, Sherry and Cindy, had grown up and moved out, but Trudy never saw that as a loss. She loved her independence. She had friends to meet, music to sing along to, and stories to tell. Trudy was one of those people whose joy seemed to radiate. She had this uncanny ability to make you feel like the most important person in the world, especially when she hugged you. And I know that is super specific, but it's because of one quote that really stuck out when I was researching this. According to her close friend, Melissa Bradbury, those hugs were really special. Quote, "Your whole world was safe when Trudy hugged you." And in a town like East Hampton, that meant something. People looked out for each other. They remembered who smiled at them in the grocery store, who bought cookies to Sunday Mass, who stopped their bike to say hello. Trudy did all of that every single time. She liked country music, Christmas songs, polkas, anything cheerful and nostalgic. She sang along with utter delight, especially around the holidays, and always had a laugh ready to share. She was known as constantly laughing, just being a really positive person, always having a good time. But behind the songs and smiles was a woman who worked hard. She was a home healthcare aide. She gave her time and energy to helping elderly people live with dignity. And on top of that, she picked up shifts at a dry cleaner in the nearby Colchester. That's just who she was. Generous to a fault, always putting others first. Her daughter Cindy once said, Trudy, quote, "liked to take in sunshine on the first warm day of spring." And that's exactly what she was to most people. A proper ray of sunshine, which is why her disappearance was felt so deeply in the community. Her friend, the one I mentioned earlier, Melissa Bradbury, said it really clearly, quote, "She would never leave her dog. Something is wrong." And the people of East Hampton felt that too. This was a tight-knit town, the kind where people knew each other's names, jobs, birthdays. So when Trudy didn't come home that night, when her car was found with those keys still in it and Muffin was rescued but Trudy was missing, it didn't just send whispers through the streets. It sent a real, genuine fear. And that fear was about to grow because in the days ahead, as police started retracing Trudy's steps, they would discover things, quiet, subtle things that didn't quite add up. Trudy's final day was, by all accounts, a good one. She spent it with her close friend Sandra, and the two women had a full-on girls' day. Errands, laughter, little indulgences and treats along the way. And Sandra dropped Trudy off at her apartment at 4:30 p.m. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Later that evening at 8 p.m, Trudy called another friend of hers, Marcus. The conversation wasn't long, but it was casual, familiar, normal. That was the last time Trudy was ever heard from. It was just after 3 p.m. on January 12th, 1998, so the day after Trudy was reported missing, that a group of high school students who were bored after school and with nowhere in particular to be, that they headed towards a local teenage hangout spot, Engle Falls. Now, this wasn't your average hangout. It was remote, tucked deep inside of the woods off of a road, about 2 miles outside the centre of East Hampton. It's somewhere that you wouldn't just stumble across. You really had to know it was there. There's no benches, no lights, no welcoming signs. It's literally just trees, water, and the sounds of nature. That's it. As the teens wandered near the edge of the wooden bridge that arched over this shallow kind of stream, they did what is pretty standard, it's what teens do. They started throwing rocks into the water. I guess they were testing echoes, skipping stones, things like that. But as one of them leaned over to aim a particularly large rock at the water, he froze. Below the surface, partially hidden in the rippling water, was something pale, flesh-coloured, human. They scrambled down into the ravine to get a better look. The closer they got, the more real it became. Tangled in the reeds, face down in the icy current, was the body of a woman, and her hands were bound behind her back. By the time police arrived, the sky was starting to get grey. The woman in the stream was face down. She was wearing a jumper, but nothing else. She had one earring still in place, one contact lens still in her eye, and her body was cold. Her arms had been duct taped at the wrists, and there was more tape that was discovered scattered nearby, almost as if it had been kind of hastily ripped or it had come loose. The woman was partially submerged in the water, but that water, even though it was just a few inches deep where she was found, That was enough to erase any trace evidence of who had done this. And to detectives who arrived first on the scene, there was no question. They didn't need to wait for dental records or fingerprint matches. They knew this was Trudy. And what investigators realised pretty immediately was that this wasn't where the crime had happened. This was a dump site. The ground around the water was disturbed. The reeds were clearly crushed and the dirt showed scuff signs or like drag marks. A vehicle had pulled up as nearby as it could get on the road, and then someone had literally dragged Trudy to this spot in the water. Whoever had brought Trudy here had done so in a rush, and even though the area was remote, it wasn't inaccessible. It was only a short drive from Main Street, from the laundromat, from the last place Trudy had ever been. The autopsy found that Trudy had died of manual strangulation. This meant whoever did this looked her in the eyes as she died. This wasn't distant or detached. It was close, intimate, personal. And now it was official. The quiet town of East Hampton had a killer on the loose. The chief of police didn't hesitate. A $30,000 reward was posted for any information leading to an arrest. This was serious money in a place like this, and it sent a very clear message. Someone knows something. It turns out, detectives weren't starting from zero. According to retired Sergeant Garrett Kelly, there were 5 immediate suspects, and each one had a story worth telling. First up, Trudy's on and off again boyfriend, Steve. Steve wasn't the controlling, jealous type. In fact, he pointed investigators quite quickly in a totally different direction. He gave his alibi, and then he told police that Trudy had recently been being watched. Literally, there was a man, a stranger, a peeping Tom, who had been spotted through Trudy's bedroom window. He was just peering through. And he'd spooked her badly enough that she'd actually been thinking about moving house. And this will come back later, the fact that she was thinking about moving. The detectives called this guy just Mr. Peeping Tom because they really didn't have any more information about him. They didn't have an identification. And of course, tracking down someone like that is not easy. By design, these men do not want to be seen. And this one had somehow vanished just as quickly as he appeared. He had no name, no face, just this kind of unsettling possibility. He could be anyone. 3 other men also made the list, each with some kind of either romantic or social tie to Trudy. This wasn't surprising. Trudy was well loved. She was super social, independent. She had admirers. She had a history. And one of these men was an on-again, off-again love interest, a man who still lingered in her life. But he didn't really sound guilty. He had an alibi, kind of. From what I could understand, it was vague, but it wasn't disprovable, and police leaned towards believing him for whatever reason. The other 2 men had solid alibis, no access, no timeline, and so they were scratched off pretty early. And that left one final suspect for now, and one final name, Gerald Brian Tuttle. That name might sound familiar. He's the handyman Jeanette Adams bumped into that freezing January morning at the laundromat. The same Gerald who casually mentioned that he had noticed the car running with the dog inside and that he had called the police about it. Except he hadn't. When officers checked the logs, there was no call from Gerald. Nothing. Not that day, not the day before, not ever. And suddenly, his innocent little comment wasn't just weird, it was full-on sus. Why would he lie about that unless he was hiding something? Because now the whole scene at the laundromat felt off. Jeanette had been the one to find the car, Jeanette had been the one to call it in, and Gerald was already inside. Alone, working, allegedly, but had he been watching or waiting? No one knew what Gerald was doing in those hours before Jeanette arrived, and now detectives couldn't stop wondering, what if Gerald had found the car? What if Gerald had left it there? The story Gerald Tuttle had started with was just pretty much starting to come apart, pretty much straight away as he started giving officers more details. And it began with little things, comments, rumours, gut feelings. It wasn't anything you could actually hand over to a jury, but detectives knew better than to ignore a gut feeling, especially when it came wrapped in inconsistencies and lies. At first, Gerald was barely more than a name in the mix, just this handyman who worked in the building where Trudy had done her laundry. He said he didn't even know her. He claimed he didn't even own a car. He didn't drive. Now, when police spotted scratches on his face during one of the interviews, he even brushed that off, quote, "probably happened while I was working." It just didn't seem legit to the investigators questioning him, and probably to you at home as well. When I read that that was his excuse, probably just happened when I was working, I just thought, like, this guy's not even trying. He really thinks if he just shuts up and doesn't say anything, then they won't question him anymore. And so, investigators started retracing his movements that day. And as they did that, things began to unravel. Witnesses placed him at the local pizza place, drinking heavily, not just having a pint, he was drunk, slurring his words, oversharing, going on and on about how hard life was, how everything was crashing down around him. His tone wasn't angry, it was detached, nervous. Something wasn't right. And the more they looked into him, the more suspicious the investigating team became. They found out that 7 years earlier, he'd been visiting a friend he'd known literally since he was a child, and that friend's wife was asleep on the sofa. Gerald saw her, just sleeping there in her own house, where she was supposed to feel safe, and he took that away from her. He brutally raped her. The rape, like many sexual assaults, was never reported, so there was no official record of it. No police, no arrest, but it had happened and numerous people knew about it. That was disturbing enough, but this time there was something official on record too. Gerald was a convicted sex offender. In 1989, he attacked a woman in East Haddam, a stranger. He had raped her and served just over 2 years behind bars. That was it. He had a pattern, one police were suddenly seeing very, very clearly. We know that Gerald told detectives he didn't know Trudy. He'd never met her, he'd never spoken to her. But Trudy had done her laundry at that very building where Gerald worked almost daily, and witnesses did remember having seen them talk. One woman even mentioned a moment when they'd laughed together in passing, and so suddenly Gerald's story was shown to be totally false. When detectives asked how Gerald could have transported a body, he was confident. He didn't even have a car. But the thing is, that just wasn't true. He was literally lying to officers and just thought they wouldn't find out. People had seen him driving the day that Trudy went missing. And not just once, not just on one street. He'd been to a string of bars and houses that day, drinking at every single one. And he'd driven to them all. Drinking and driving, come on, sir. The car, it turned out, belonged to his ex-girlfriend, but he used it all the time and everyone knew that. It wasn't his, but it was available to him. And then someone walked into the police station to report something, and this would be the real break in the case in terms of forensics. His name was Asa. He was calm, respectful, but clearly very uneasy. He said his cousin had asked him to get rid of a car. Just like that, quote, "I don't care what you do with it, just get rid of it." Now, Asa had found this strange, but what made it worse was the fact that the cousin had a conviction for sexual assault. So Asa began to think that something was up, and so he'd gone to the police station that day, and the car was still sat outside his home. He hadn't gotten rid of it. No prizes for guessing his cousin's name. It was Gerald Brian Tuttle. Detectives tracked down Gerald's ex-girlfriend Denise, the one who actually owned the car. She didn't hesitate. She told them that they could look at the car, they could take it, whatever they needed. She also told them that Gerald hadn't had permission to use it. In fact, she'd been trying to get it back. They'd fought recently really badly, and she suspected he was using drugs again and was genuinely afraid for herself, for her child, for what he might do next. When police confronted Gerald with this, He admitted, he had used the car, but he insisted it was innocent. He just hadn't wanted to admit it earlier because, get this, he didn't have a valid license. A license. That is the lie he chose to go with. Okay. A search warrant was issued for his home and they conducted a full forensic search, but kind of unsurprisingly, there was no smoking gun, there was no blood, no fibres, no clear trace of Trudy, but all that really showed was that the crime scene wasn't in Gerald's apartment. Meanwhile, the car had been taken in for forensics, and from behind the front driver and passenger seats, they ended up removing these sections of black upholstery, 2 pieces of fabric that looked like they had something smeared on them. And at first it wasn't clear what that was, but when the forensic tests came back a few weeks later in July, it was clear it was fecal matter. Now, on the day Trudy's body was discovered, the state's chief medical examiner noted that fecal matter had been found on Trudy's back. Fecal matter isn't really an odd thing to find after a death because the muscles relax as a natural consequence of your body's muscles kind of just losing tension. Your muscles loosen immediately and it releases strain on the bowel and the bladder, and it leads to the bowel and bladder just emptying. This meant wherever Trudy had been before being dumped in the creek, that's where the fecal matter would have been first, and that was what they found in the car. The slight issue here is that this is back in the late 1990s and DNA testing just isn't as advanced as it obviously would come to be, and so they couldn't get a clear DNA profile from that fecal matter. After that, police turned their attention back to the building where Trudy had first gone missing, the laundromat, but not on the ground floor where people did their washing. Instead, they went up to a remote, under-construction apartment at the top of the building, a place only a few people had access to because one of them was Gerald. Inside, investigators found something, actually 2 somethings. One was a small gold earring and the other was a contact lens. The earring matched what Trudy had been wearing when she vanished, and the contact lens was the exact prescription and strength issued to Trudy. They managed to find this out by basically tracking down the original manufacturer of that contact lens, getting in contact with them, and then being able to match it to the one that Trudy was found wearing. Even more disturbing was that investigators also found in this little area there was fecal matter smeared on the radiator board inside the unit. All of that evidence told detectives something devastating. Trudy had been in that apartment. Alive or dead, she had been there, and this was critical and absolutely terrifying, there were no signs of forced entry, no scuffle, no screaming, no indication that she'd been dragged or coerced, which meant she had likely gone up willingly. And suddenly, something one witness said early on became extremely important. A friend of Trudy's told police that at one time, she'd actually overheard a conversation not long before the murder. Gerald had been telling Trudy about the renovations being done at the building. The new apartments would be available soon. And, as we know, she was worried about this peeping Tom outside her current apartment. And so it was discussed that maybe she should come and take a look, maybe even rent one. And of course, the person who was saying this to Trudy was Gerald. It all lined up. Police now believed that Gerald had lured Trudy upstairs under the pretense of showing her the newly renovated space. And once he had her alone, away from the street, away from help, he attacked. Now, that is the theory that police went with, but even with all of this, and to be honest, they kind of know that it's Gerald by this point, but they still don't have the forensic links because of how forensic technology worked back then. But thankfully, things would change with the advancements in DNA technology, but it wouldn't be for some time. It was in 2008 that a familiar face returned to the case. One of the original detectives had joined Connecticut's Division of Criminal Justice Cold Case Unit. It was a team made up of seasoned investigators from various cities and towns, and they were combining forces with personnel from the state's attorneys' offices and Department of Corrections. Their mission was to solve the unsolvable. And for this detective, that one cold case that had never stopped haunting him was Trudy's. He decided to go back to the beginning. And this time, he brought something new. Hope in the form of science. As forensic technology had leapt forward in the years since Trudy's murder, he resubmitted evidence to the state forensic lab. It would take, however, 5 more years for the lab to call back with the appropriate results. And when they did, they told him they had exactly what he needed. On the non-adhesive side of the piece of duct tape found near Trudy's body, all the way back in 1998, analysts discovered something that hadn't been possible to detect before: DNA. A mixture. It belonged to Trudy and Gerald. But that wasn't all. In the same forensic reanalysis, the upholstery from the Volvo, the one Gerald had been driving around the time of Trudy's murder, that had obviously tested positive for fecal matter, but it also now tested positive for human semen. Both substances belonged to 2 different people. One of them was Trudy. This was confirmed without doubt, and it placed Trudy in the car for certain. And the other, the semen, was from Gerald. Quote, "We had the link to the victim. It was clearly her fecal matter. And we had the link to Tuttle because his DNA was mixed in with hers. He called it the linchpin. It was the piece they'd been missing, the piece that tied Gerald undeniably and physically to Trudy. But when detectives tried to locate him, however, Gerald was gone. 16 years had passed since Trudy's body was found in the brook, and now, with their first real shot at justice, they were on the hunt for a man who seemed to have vanished. He'd moved out of state, he'd kept his head down, he really had tried to disappear. But someone, somewhere, and I really couldn't find the details of this, but either way the result's the same, someone had seen him and they tipped off the police. He was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. When authorities arrived, Gerald was a shadow of his former self, morbidly obese, immobile, and tethered to an oxygen tank. He actually could no longer fly commercially because of his size and health, so detectives transported him back, strapped into a police van for this long drive north. He, of course, claimed he was innocent, and even when he was charged, he refused a plea deal. On March 30th, 2016, Gerald stood before a court and declared that he would take the case to trial. But in the 11th hour, on the evening of the proceedings, something changed. Maybe it was the evidence, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just the knowledge that his time was up. In August 2016, Gerald pleaded guilty in Middlesex Superior Court to first-degree manslaughter and second-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to 20 years, suspended after 18, with 5 years probation for manslaughter and 20 years suspended after 12 for kidnapping. Combined, that deal would see him serve 30 years in prison, which obviously isn't a huge amount, but I really don't think he's going to last that long, to be honest. When he appeared in court, Gerald was unrecognisable. He was in a wheelchair, oxygen mask strapped to his face, eyes closed through most of the proceedings. And when he was given a chance to speak, he didn't want to. He said nothing, no apology, no explanation. Prosecutor Peter McShane spoke about Trudy's daughter, Cindy. Quote, "He didn't even have the decency to look at her. It proves what kind of a person he is." Cindy didn't hold back. Quote, "She was scared, alone. The last thing she saw before she died was your hands and the rage in your eyes." Trudy, she told the court, had been abducted from the laundromat, beaten, strangled, and dumped like garbage in a freezing brook. After the killing, we know Gerald vanished, and detectives had followed him for days, and they even tracked him to a psychiatric hospital before he then disappeared down south. Cindy described the years that followed as some kind of torture, wondering if there was ever going to be an arrest, wondering if he might hurt someone else. Quote, "You had 15 years of undeserved freedom. After I leave here today, I'm the one who's free."